Now for this first pin tuck, I've gone ahead and chalked a line down the length of my fabric to start with a straight row. So I'm going to line up my chalked line with this stitching line that's marked at the center of my presser foot, and I'm going to lower that so that is right lined up with my chalked line. And this is going to help me to create my first line that is straight. So then I'm simply going to sew down the length of my fabric. And there you can see we have our first pin tuck row. And again, I have this done with hot pink thread so that this is clearly visible as I'm doing this demonstration. But when you're doing this on your garment, you would have either matching thread or white thread or something that is more intentional with your design. So as you can see here, it is pulling this slightly to create a raised pin tuck. So it's creating, in essence, a fold in the fabric that's causing that to sit up a tiny bit. Now again, this is with the 9 groove Pintuck foot, which creates a very small tuck. So with a twin needle that has a larger spacing, you will get a larger tuck. Now, depending on the design that I want to do, if I want to have my pin tucks be right next to each other, so in the Boomer Falls bodice, this is 3 together and they're spaced apart in between the sets of 3. So these pin tucks, regardless of how much I have folded over, are pretty close together. So if I wanted to create a piece of fabric that I would cut out with this pattern piece, I would set my pin tucks really close together in sets of 3 and then place my pattern piece to cut them out. But as a contrasting example, if I wanted to do the steam bib top, I have 3 spaced apart pin tucks, 1 on each side of this bib section. So I would then just look at how far apart these are spaced, and I would do my rows of pin tucks accordingly on the fabric before I cut this piece out. So on this example, I would space this over on 3 grooves of my pin tuck. But on this example, I would likely run them right next to each other, 3 in a row. So I'll show you the 2 sets of pin tucks and what that looks like. So for this first example, I'm going to simply slide this over slightly and then lower the presser foot so that this first pin tuck is now going straight underneath in this second groove line, and this line is going to create a pin tuck right next to my first pin tuck. And then I will just gently glide the fabric while the pin tuck is sliding through this groove right next to it. Then to create the third pin tuck, I'm going to slide that one over. So I have 2 pin tucks in the second 2 grooves after my first stitch line, and then I'll run my third pin tuck. So here is that first set of 3 pin tucks. And if you look at that compared to my original bodice piece, where I would have 3 pin tucks at the top and then my next set of 3 right here, you can see that these are actually really close together. So after looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and do a new set. I'm going to space them apart, spacing an added groove on my foot in between each one to get a little bit more of a pin tuck spread at the set before I move on to my next one. So now I'm going to set this down so that the pin tuck fits 2 slots over from my stitch line. So this one's going to go down right here, and then I'm going to stitch a pin tuck a little bit farther apart. And then I'm going to do the same thing one more time and do my third pin tuck. So you can see here I have a slot in between each groove that is empty. So these pin tucks are now spacing about 1/8 of an inch apart. Now we can take a look at this second set. You can see these are a little bit farther apart than my first set that was really close together. So in comparison to the design, now if I want to set this here, the stitching line for each of these lines up with the stitching lines of this example right here. I just don't have as much of a pin tuck folded, which is fine. It creates the same effect on the bodice. It's just a different technique. So now I'm just going to want to determine how far before my second set of pin tucks and then mark accordingly with my chalk to create my second row of 3. So now this is marked 3/8 inch over from my last pin tuck, and I'm going to start a new set of pin tucks. So here you can see we have 2 sets of pin tucks, and this is beginning to line up with the same design idea as this bodice. So we would repeat this the 3rd time, and then you would take your pattern piece, place it on top, and cut it out according to the pattern directions. Now this spacing was with 1 groove space in between. And if I'm looking at the steam bib top, these are much further apart. So I could lay these on top of here and compare. And you can see that this spacing is much closer together. So we'll want to measure the distance between these pin tucks and then use the groove on the foot accordingly. Now I have my first pin tuck row stitched, and I'm simply going to place this in the farthest groove to the left, and then I will stitch on the stitching line the next row of pin tucks. Then to create my 3rd row, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to lower the presser foot down with the pin tuck I just created in that last groove. So this one is now extending beyond the presser foot, and then I'm going to stitch my 3rd row. And there you can see 3 evenly spaced pin tucks that are farther apart. So that would work for this steam bib top, and you can see if I just place my existing shirt to line up with these pin tucks and the stitching lines. Now again, the amount of the tuck, the part that's folded, is different, but the overall look and the spacing of the tucks is the same. So I have 1 tuck here, 1 tuck stitching line here, and then my final one here. So if I have this set, and then I would go over and place my pattern piece so that it lines up with the guide. First pin tuck here, and then the other ones work their way out to the side of the shirt this way. And then I would cut this pattern piece out with my pin tucks already created, and then do a mirror image for the opposite side with 3 rows of pin tucks stitched exactly like these. Now I have one added example, which is to combine pin tucks with a decorative stitch. So if you create your pin tucks far enough apart, and then you sample out some decorative stitches like this one to be sure that the width of the stitch will fit in between the pin tucks, you can then combine the 2 by stitching your pin tucks and then adding a decorative stitch in between the rows of pin tucks. Now depending on your foot, I have to switch mine back to my standard presser foot because the opening is larger here. On my pin tuck foot with the 9 groove, it is a very small opening, so it won't accommodate a stitch that's going back and forth without breaking my needle. But you can look, some pin tuck foots are different. You may be able to leave this foot on and do your decorative stitch while your tucks are still being guided by the grooves, which is helpful. So just look at the pin tuck foot you have and see. If not, what we're going to do is set our 2 pin tucks and visually keep them lined up with the part of the presser foot we can use to guide. So I have my presser foot open exactly the same as the spacing of my pin tucks. So that makes that easy for me to line up. And then I'm going to run my decorative stitch row right down the center. And there you can see we've added that. So that's starting to create a little bit more of an heirloom look to the stitching that you have. And you can use these designs on different things. This could be a border on the edge of a skirt. It can also be the part of the shirt that lays in right here, and maybe you don't have 3 pin tucks, but you have pin tucks and some added stitching. And again, if this is all done in the same thread as the fabric, it just creates added texture and interest without creating so much contrast. So here you can see that done in a white fabric with white thread and how it just adds a little bit of interest and detail, but it doesn't take over the design, which is great. It's just adding another layer of interest and detail to the overall look.